Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez. For most of us, night is something we don't think much about. It's when we lock our doors, turn off the lights, and go to sleep with the assumption that everything will still be there in the morning. We trust that someone, somewhere, is still awake. That systems are in place. That if something goes wrong, it will be noticed. But for most of history, that wasn't the case. Night didn't come with systems, and it didn't come with guarantees. When a town went to sleep, it didn't become safe. It became quiet. The moment the last shop closed and the last candle was blown out, the streets changed. Sounds carried farther than they did during the day, and shadows stretched into places that had been clear just hours before. Familiar roads and buildings took on a different shape once the light was gone. A fire could begin and spread before anyone realized it had started. An argument could turn violent without interruption. A stranger could walk through an entire town without being seen or questioned. Darkness didn't create danger, but it made it easier for danger to go unnoticed. Because of that, someone had to remain awake. Someone had to walk those streets while everyone else slept. Not to solve problems, not to chase anyone down, but simply to notice when something was wrong before it became something worse. That responsibility fell to a single person, and for centuries, that person was known as the Night Watchman. The Night Watchman existed long before anything resembling modern policing. In many towns, he was the only form of overnight protection, the only presence moving through the streets after dark. This wasn't folklore or ceremony. It was a real job, one that people were paid to do or, in some cases, required to take part in. Towns, parishes, and groups of merchants depended on it. The expectations were simple, at least on paper. Stay awake, walk the streets, and raise the alarm if something went wrong. The origins of the Night Watch stretch back to medieval Europe, where growing towns faced new problems that daylight alone couldn't manage. Buildings were constructed close together, often out of wood, and fire was a constant threat. At the same time, darkness created opportunity for theft, violence, and disorder. In England, early forms of the Night Watch were organized by parish or ward, and citizens were sometimes required by law to take turns serving. This wasn't a prestigious duty. It was an obligation, one that many people tried to avoid. Over time, as towns expanded and the responsibilities became more demanding, the system shifted toward paid watchmen. Even then, the pay was low, and the expectations remained high. When European settlers came to North America, they brought this system with them. Colonial towns quickly adopted night watches for the same reasons. Buildings were tightly packed, fire could spread rapidly, and help was often far away. In cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, watchmen were hired to patrol the streets after dark, following set routes and reporting anything unusual. Their authority was limited, and their tools were simple, but their presence mattered. In many ways, they were the only line between order and uncertainty during the night. A typical shift for a night watchman began at dusk and lasted until dawn. He would follow the same path over and over again, walking past the same doors, the same alleys, and the same corners, repeating the route until morning. He carried a lantern to light his way, but the lantern also served another purpose. It signaled that someone was awake. That small moving light was often enough to make a difference. It reminded anyone watching from a window or standing in the shadows that the streets were not entirely unguarded. Along with the lantern, a watchman might carry a wooden staff or a short club, not necessarily to fight, but to create distance if needed. In some towns, watchmen were also equipped with bells, rattles, or whistles that could be used to raise an alarm. One of their more unusual duties was calling out the hours. At regular intervals throughout the night, the watchman would announce the time, sometimes along with the weather. This practice served multiple purposes. It reassured residents that the watchman was awake, it helped people keep track of time during the night, and it reinforced the idea that someone was present in the darkness. Most nights, nothing happened. The watchman wasn't there to stop every problem, but to notice the first sign of one. Fire remained the greatest concern. A single spark from a chimney, a tipped candle, or an unattended hearth could destroy an entire street before morning. The watchman learned to rely on his senses. The smell of smoke, a faint glow where there shouldn't be one, or the subtle crackle of something burning could be the only warning. Catching it early could mean the difference between a small incident and a disaster. As the year moved into autumn, the job became more difficult. Darkness arrived earlier in the day, stretching the watchman's shift longer into the night. Cold temperatures set in, making it harder to stay alert. Fires burned hotter and longer as people tried to keep warm, increasing the risk of accidents. Fog and mist became more common, dulling sound and reducing visibility. The lantern's light didn't travel as far, and the streets felt even more enclosed. October didn't create the role of the night watchman, but it exposed its limits. Longer hours, harsher conditions, and increased risk made an already difficult job even harder. Much of what we know about night watchmen comes not from their own records, but from those who observed them. One of the most valuable sources is Samuel Pepys, whose detailed diaries provide insight into life in 17th century London. Pepys frequently mentioned the presence of watchmen in the streets at night, describing their calls, their routines, and sometimes their failures. He wrote about walking through the city after dark and hearing the watchmen announce the hours, their voices echoing through otherwise silent streets. During the Great Fire of London in 1666, Pepys documented the confusion and panic that unfolded, including the inability of the watch system to respond effectively once the fire began to spread. His accounts don't describe anything supernatural, but they do capture the atmosphere of a city that felt different at night, a place where order seemed thinner and uncertainty more present. Over time, the night watchman became connected to local folklore and superstition. This wasn't because watchmen were seen as supernatural figures themselves, but because they were often the only people awake to witness anything unusual. If something appeared in the street after midnight, it wasn't seen by someone asleep in bed. It was seen by the person already walking through the dark. In parts of Britain, stories circulated about figures that appeared at crossroads or along empty roads, sometimes described as silent shapes or distant figures that vanished when approached. Watchmen were often said to be the first to encounter these things, not as investigators, but as witnesses. In early American towns, similar beliefs developed. Night watchmen reported hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there, seeing lights in buildings that should have been empty, or noticing movement in places that couldn't be easily explained. These accounts were rarely written down in official records, but they persisted in local stories and oral tradition. The watchman's role placed him in what could be described as a liminal space, moving between the active world of the day and the stillness of the night. He walked past graveyards, churches, and places associated with death, all at hours when those places felt different. Over time, it became easy to associate the job with the idea that the watchman might see things others never would. Even the tools of the job carried their own associations. Bells, which were used to signal emergencies, were also connected to death in many traditions. Hearing a bell ring unexpectedly at night could be interpreted as a warning or an omen. Because watchmen were responsible for sounding alarms, their presence became tied not only to safety, but also to the possibility of something going wrong. The line between practical duty and superstition was never clearly defined. While much of this remained in the realm of belief, the idea that someone walking alone at night might experience something unsettling never disappeared. In more recent times, the role of the night watchman has largely been replaced by modern security guards, but the conditions are often similar. Empty buildings, long hours, and isolation still define the job. In some cases, the experiences reported by these modern workers echo the same themes found in older folklore. At the former Fairfield Hills Hospital in Connecticut, a large psychiatric facility that operated through much of the 20th century, night security guards reported a number of unusual occurrences during overnight shifts. Guards described hearing footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing on floors that had been locked, and lights turning on in areas where power had been shut off. These reports came from multiple individuals working independently, and while none of the events were ever confirmed to be supernatural, they were also never fully explained. The guards were not paranormal investigators or thrill seekers. They were employees assigned to monitor a property, performing a job not unlike that of the night watchmen who came before them.
Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
At the turn of the 20th century, newspapers in New York were carrying another story that fit that same uneasy pattern. Near Middletown, at a place called Ingalls Crossing on the Ontario and Western Railroad, accounts began to circulate that the company could not keep a night watchman at the post. According to those reports, 9 men in all either took the job or were assigned to it, and one after another gave it up after claiming the crossing was haunted. The reports described the same general complaint each time: shrieking and wailing in the darkness, strange forms near the tracks, and the sense that the place was occupied by something no living man wanted to share a shift with. One of the earliest men named in the reports was James Coe, a section gang worker who reportedly took the job because it seemed easier than regular railroad labor. He lasted 2 nights. Another man supposedly made it 3. A third did not even finish a full shift before quitting after claiming he had encountered what one paper described as a bloody, mangled wraith while gathering brush for the watch shanty. Even the section boss, determined to prove the whole thing was nonsense, reportedly took the assignment himself and gave up after only 2 nights, later saying that anyone who could hold down that job ought to be paid the salary of the railroad president. By late January of 1899, the haunting at Ingalls Crossing had spread through regional newspapers, where it was treated with that familiar mix of mockery, fascination, and just enough detail to keep people reading. The story also comes with an important caution. Later research has turned up the crossing itself, but not a confirmed record of the supposed September 1898 wreck that was said to have started the haunting. In other words, the post was real. The reported watchmen were real, and the fear around the crossing was real enough to make newspapers take notice. But the disaster said to explain the ghosts remains frustratingly hard to verify. That uncertainty only makes the story stranger. It may have been exaggerated newspaper lore. It may have grown out of a lesser incident that changed shape over time. Or it may simply be one more example of what happens when men are asked to stand alone in the dark long enough for every sound to begin feeling alive. Another modern account follows that same pattern, though the setting is very different. In both a KHON2 report and an HPD-produced paranormal story segment, a former overnight guard described unsettling experiences at the Honolulu Police Department's training academy in Waipahu. The account says that once the daytime activity was gone, the property felt completely different at night, dark, empty, and unnaturally still. On one shift, the guard, identified as Tony, reported hearing a loud clanking sound near the SWAT house, like wood striking together. As he moved toward it, the dogs in the kennels reportedly began barking and reacting as well. When he got closer, he said he saw the wooden shutters opening and closing repeatedly, even though the night was calm and no one was inside. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The noise ended, the dogs went quiet, and the building appeared empty. According to that same account, a few nights later, Tony was making his usual rounds, securing the front gate and checking the grounds, when he sat briefly in the breezeway and noticed an old woman dressed in white walking toward him across the parking lot. At first, he thought she might be a real person who needed help. Then he realized he had never heard the gate open. He stood up to address her, and she disappeared. When he turned, she was there again. He said she began moving slowly toward him, staring directly at him, then vanished a second time. A moment later, according to his retelling, she appeared once more, now seated directly across from him. That was enough for him to leave. The report also says many officers associated with the academy have spoken of ghostly experiences there. That does not prove a haunting, but it places the story in a long tradition of night workers becoming the only witnesses to things they cannot easily explain. The similarities are difficult to ignore. The setting may have changed, and the tools may have evolved, but the core experience remains the same. A single person, awake while others sleep, moving through quiet spaces where anything out of place becomes immediately noticeable. Whether in a medieval town, a 19th century railroad crossing, or a modern hospital or training facility, that role carries the same sense of isolation and the same potential for unease. The person assigned to watch at night is still the one expected to notice what others miss, still the one left to make sense of sounds, movement, and moments that feel ordinary in daylight but seem to change shape after midnight. The human cost of the job has always been significant. Night watchmen were often drawn from the lower ranks of society, taking work that others avoided. The pay was low, the hours were long, and the conditions were difficult. Walking the same route night after night, often in cold or damp weather, took a toll. Fatigue was constant, and the lack of social standing meant that watchmen were rarely given the benefit of the doubt. When things went well, their work went unnoticed. When something went wrong, they were often the first to be blamed. As towns grew into cities, the limitations of the night watch system became more apparent. One person could no longer reasonably cover the necessary ground, and the risks increased with population density. Gradually, more organized systems were introduced. Groups of watchmen replaced individuals, and eventually, formal police forces took over the role entirely. Advances in lighting and communication further reduced the need for a single person to patrol alone in the dark. The night watchman didn't disappear overnight, but over time, the role faded. It was replaced by systems that were more efficient, more coordinated, and less dependent on a single individual. Even so, the idea of someone walking alone at night, keeping watch while others sleep, has remained. Looking back, the night watchman occupies a quiet place in history. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a central figure in most records, but he was necessary. For centuries, safety depended on someone willing to stay awake, to walk through darkness, and to notice the things others never saw. He didn't stop the night, and he didn't control it. He simply moved through it, one step at a time, until morning came. And even now, long after the job itself has disappeared, the idea remains that somewhere, someone is still awake, walking through the quiet, noticing what doesn't belong. That's going to do it for this episode on The Night Watchman. If you have any questions, comments, or want to suggest a topic for a future show, send me an email, thehalloweenpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to check out our website, thehalloweenpodcast.com, and like our Facebook page at facebook.com/thehalloweenpodcast. Thanks again for listening. Have a good night.